It wasn't obvious at first that our company was struggling, at least to someone who didn't have access to our company's financials. But then I started to notice things. Hiring was looked at more closely. Maybe a team said that they needed a developer, and then later on, it seemed like the powers that be would ask you, do you really need another person in your team? And then at some point, hiring was frozen altogether. We also noticed that for a company that was known for being transparent, things were no longer so transparent. So what would normally happen is you'd request a meeting with one of your bosses, you'd go to the calendar, and you'd be able to see what was keeping your boss busy. Say for a Wednesday afternoon, you wanted to see them, but they had a product feature meeting, so you couldn't see them. Nowadays, you'd see across their calendar, busy, busy, busy. But then the announcement came that there was a mandatory meeting and everyone must attend. If people weren't worried about things yet, then the announcement of this mandatory meeting was sure to ring some alarm bells. The company was quickly running out of money. The runway for the company was running out, and we were told that we had to save a bunch of money. So we were told this is how much money we had to save in total. We were told roughly how many roles would be affected as a result of this cost saving. A quarter of our company was going to be let go. My manager at the time gave me a heads up that he strongly suspected QA or testing would be severely affected. And to be honest, this didn't really come as a surprise to anyone, because when it comes to cost savings, people, at least in my experience, have often looked at QA and testing. He said, based on what he was hearing, test automation knowledge or lack thereof would be the deciding factor as to whether or not someone would be made redundant. And as someone who had just started learning test automation at this point in her career, I was understandably pretty worried. About 3 to 4 weeks later, I was called into a meeting room with someone from HR and someone from the engineering leadership team. And I remember there was a box of tissues on the table. And I remember being slightly offended, almost thinking, are you expecting me to cry? Yeah. Almost like a challenge. But lo and behold, I walked out of that room crying with used tissues in my hand. I had just been let go. Even though I was given a heads up by my manager at the time, I was still shocked. You see, often the employee-employer relationship ends because the employee has decided to leave. So maybe they found another role, maybe they're going to start their own business, or they're going to go traveling. But it hits different when you're the one being let go, because it feels like a rejection. I remember thinking, no, you dump me, you don't dump me, I dump you. But that's how it's gone for my other employee-employee relationships. So it actually hurt quite a bit at the time. And I remember this was a company that felt like a family, and I've learned that mistake, to be honest. Now, fortunately for me, I had already started investing in my career. But first, I'm going to go into what do I even mean by that? So what is an investment? According to Investopedia, an investment is an asset or item acquired with the goal of generating income. So it'd be through, it concerned the outlay of some capital today, so time, effort, money, or an asset in the hope of a greater payoff in the future. You may be wondering, how does this apply to one's career? So in the past, I've put in time and effort, sometimes even my own money, to invest in myself or as a software tester in hopes of a greater payoff in the future. Now, if you was to liken it to finance, you'd be putting in like say money into an account or into investment funds. And then you'd have to be patient, and then later you see the rewards, or hopefully, depending on when you try to cash out. For me, a lot of the things I did earlier in my career didn't really show a tangible benefit until much later. So things that happened like 10 years ago. Now, I said that I was fortunate that I had already started investing myself, and this is what I was already doing at that point in time. To set some context, I was laid off 7 years ago, so I'm speaking about a story in further in the past. I can speak about it in a non-emotional way, fortunately. And I was fairly early in my career, so I was 3 years in. The three things I was doing was first, blogging. I had started blogging just shy of a year into my career, early 2016. And I did this to improve my written communication skills. I find that for me, writing helps me think clearly, and I wanted to get better at that. And especially when you have to like write bugs, argue cases, you don't always have the benefit of face-to-face communication. The second thing I was doing was reading books and blogs on testing. I was also reading books and blogs on topics that I feel would benefit a tester. So at this point in time, I remember having read Agile Testing by Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory, Spec by Example by Goiko. I'm so scared of pronouncing the name. I can see it. And a few other things. I don't remember everything I'd read up until that point. And I also remember reading a lot of blogs. I enjoy learning. And lastly, attending and co-organizing meetups. So for the first year in my career, I was an active meetup participant, and it's kind of similar to conferences. The great thing about attending meetups and conferences is that you get to network, you get to meet with people. So not only are you investing in your skills, you're investing into your relationships. So if you're going to look into the future, like years down the track, some connections that are made at this conference could lead to jobs in a few years' time when you're like putting out your feelers. And you're like, I'm a little bit unhappy in my job. Yeah, you got anything going? That could also lead to that, but also knowledge. So I remember there were concrete ideas that I came across at these meetups that would help me later down the line. So writing bug reports, testing without requirements, and so on. Now, getting laid off was a wake-up call I needed, and it helped me become more intentional about investing in myself. You see, earlier, I was doing these things, but part of me didn't really see a point. It was pretty aimless. So getting laid off gave me some sort of direction. I started to set goals. Now, these weren't SMART goals, so they were not specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, or timely, but they helped me in some way. So the three goals I had at the time was first to become comfortable with code. A bit of background, I did a Bachelor of Arts and Commerce in economics in German. I did not have a technical background. The interaction I had with code at the time was checking out branches that the developers had worked on, doing some sort of black box testing. I saw the code, I was like, I don't know what it does. It does something. I mean, this button appears now, so I think that's a change they implemented, but I didn't understand what code did or why. And given that I was let go because of my lack of test automation skills, or more specifically, my lack of technical knowledge, I really wanted to work on this weak point. Similar to the first point, I wanted to learn UI test automation. I'm not saying this is the best place to start, but as someone who was surrounded by people who also did UI test automation, it didn't even occur to me to look at another level. And lastly, I wanted to get better at testing APIs. Again, due to my insecurity of not being technical, this is an area I was interested in. I had started to learn how to test APIs using different tools, but I knew I had a lot more to learn, and I noticed that there was some demand in this area. Now, one thing I want to point out in terms of investing in yourself is that life circumstances can change. At this point, at the start of my journey, when I became intentional, I was single, I did not have children, and time was an abundant resource. I didn't have to worry about it or anything. Now I am married with 2 kids, a 9-month-old and an almost 3-year-old. So if I thought that I lacked time and energy before, I now have the power of perspective and hindsight to realize how wrong I was. So then I found it's not just a case of finding the time, but making the time. There are 3 things that I have been mainly implementing to help me manage my time, and I hope that you learn one thing from this, or that one of these at least is new to you. The first is app and site limits. So who here implements app or site limits on their phone? Yeah. So for sites like, for me, like sites like Facebook, certain news, gossip websites, LinkedIn, Netflix, I can intend to go on these sites and only spend 5 or 10 minutes. But in fact, 1 or 2 hours can pass, and you don't know where the time went. It was very unintentional. So what I've done is, depending on the site and depending on how much time I tend to waste, I'm like 15 minutes here, 10 minutes there, and so on. I've only done this on my phone. You can also do this on your laptop, but I am hardly ever on my laptop on my personal time, so I don't see the point in that. The second thing would be time blocking. So let's say you go to yourself and you're like, I've got a goal to do this test automation course and learn Cypress. And then you got the week in front of you and you say, I'm going to do Cypress this week. I'm going to do this too. I'm going to I'm going to do 2 chapters from this online course. But what I found personally more helpful is to block out a period of time for it. So let's say I'd add to my calendar Wednesday at 8 p.m. to 9:30 after my children have gone to bed. I will work. I will do that Cypress course. So by setting out a dedicated period of time, it helps me ensure something gets done. Lastly, there's a constant reminder that I go over again and again and again and again. And that is, a yes to something is a no to something else. So there's this concept from economics called opportunity cost, which is the next best alternative for gone. So the cost you're paying for something is what you could be doing instead with your time. So if you were to talk about this conference, the opportunity cost you're paying for this would be either the other talk by Ron, or it could be time with your loved ones. It could be a project at work that you need to catch up on. So what happens is when something comes up, either at work or also in my own personal life, I'm not just thinking about the decision I have to make and whether or not I want to do this thing, but what do I have to sacrifice instead? So sometimes someone goes, oh, it's only a 30-minute call, or it's only a 1-hour meeting. But then I'm like, well, I'm not going to get that hour back. I'm not going to get that 30 minutes back. So whatever you're putting forward to me, are you worth that? It sounds pretty brutal, but for me, it has helped. So I'm by no means an advocate of like waking up at 5 a.m. and taking cold showers. But then I don't think either you should like watch Netflix all day, every day for the rest of your life and go on social media for the rest of your life. I think it helps to find a balance. So what I've tried to do is have a good overall trend. So I've had bad days, and by bad days, I mean unproductive days, bad weeks, bad months. But if I look back over the course of a year, I'm generally happy with how I've spent my time. But then I'm talking to you about how important it is to upskill, how important it is to invest yourself. But I acknowledge that upskilling can be tiring. So at the end of a work day, maybe the last thing you want to do is think about what else can I do that's kind of work related. And I'm going to be the first to admit that upskilling takes up energy. Now you may be wondering, what do I mean by this? So I'm not going to play this video. You can take a photo and then look it up later. There's this YouTube video by Ali Abdaal, and he talks about how for him to be productive, it's not really him trying to figure out how do I squeeze in more with my time, but how does he manage his energy? So he says how he limits the amount of projects he has or demanding projects. But to better illustrate this concept of managing your energy, I'm going to share with you how I manage my energy. So there are some things that give me energy and some things that take energy away from me. Baking, after I bake, it helps me recharge. Going to the gym, it depends sometimes. And hanging out with my husband and children, or basically hanging out with people that I love and care for, I always feel better after. Now, there are also things that use up my energy. So creating YouTube videos or editing, learning new test automation frameworks. I've worked in, most of my career has been in consulting. And I'm also currently at a digital product studio. So sometimes I've had to learn new things for projects, and I find them very demanding. And the lastly would be working with certain people. Now, ultimately, do more of what's on the first list to be able to do what's on the second. So if I have to upskill and I have something to learn, or I would like to learn, I need to do more of whatever's on that first list. Otherwise, I'm going to burn out and do less of the second. So I remember when I got laid off, it was a very stressful experience. And I didn't straight away start thinking, what do I need to learn? How do I upskill? Because I was tapped out. I've also had personal circumstances, which meant that I was just trying to stay afloat. So I didn't try to do anything extra. All I was doing is, how do I recharge my batteries? Now, one thing I realized pretty early on is that the only person who owns my career is me. Not my manager, not my boss, or my boss's boss, or my company, but me. So I've had some supportive managers who have pushed me in the right direction and who have been very helpful with my career, and I've had other managers. But then ultimately, I'm the one who has had to live with the decisions that I've made. Now, I've had requests for trainings and conferences denied, and then I had to, as I said earlier about investing in myself, sometimes have to put in the money to make it to these things. And I reminded myself that, again, I'm the one who owns my career. I can't always expect my employer to, I want to say be supportive, but always see eye to eye as to what I think is best for me. Now, if something was really important, I was forced to find the time and sometimes the money myself. I've met a few people who have generous conference allowances. I've met a few people who get a dedicated period of time per week or per month or per sprint to work on self-development, but I've never actually had that. So what I've been talking about in this talk is referring to something that I have done in my own time. Now, one thing I was mindful of when it came to investing in myself was making sure that I was employable. Now, it's not just because I've seen layoffs happen. So you may find yourself looking for a job when you weren't expecting to be looking for a job. But ultimately, because you may be looking for a job because you're unhappy or you're looking for a new adventure in 1, 2, 3 years' time, 10 years' time even. So then I thought it was on me to make sure that when the time came to look for a role, that I was employable. and I wanted to make sure that I had the skills that employers were looking for. I wanted to make sure I was relevant, and relevant means connected with what is happening or being discussed. How do I know if I'm relevant? So what I would do is I'd look up other roles, and I do this once or twice. I mean, my employers, not, yeah, like once or twice a year. So what I'm doing is, what I do today match what employers seem to be looking for? Now, I noticed, for example, that some more employers were starting to look for accessibility testing skills, and that's something that I see I'm somewhat weak on. I've done one beginner's course on it, but I wouldn't claim I could put it on my CV. So what it means is you're making sure you can do what they want. Now, why do I continue to invest in myself? I realized that what made me start about being intentional of investing in myself is different to why I continue to do it. So at the start, fear drove me, rejection drove me. I said earlier that the things that I chose to invest myself in was all driven out of fear of a skill that I lacked or what I couldn't do at the time. I didn't think I was good enough, and it seemed like the best choice. But now, how do you say it? But now my reasons have changed. So firstly, I feel that investing in myself has made me a better tester. By this, I mean I'm a better tester than the person I would be if I did not invest in myself. The second would be options on how to tackle testing problems. So I'll go into this. So I'm going to cover these two at the same time. If there's a saying which goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So what would happen is by exposing myself to more ideas, so by reading about testing, by going to conferences, by getting more knowledge about testing, I then know that any problems I encounter at work have multiple ways of being solved. So what would happen is I'd work with people, and it didn't occur to them that there was another way to tackle a problem that was in front of them. So I remember I worked with someone who refused to do any sort of test prep, any sort of testing until requirements were written. And I tried to talk to him about heuristics. I tried to talk to him about testing without requirements, and he would flat out refuse. Like, he was so adamant in his ways. But then I had done this Black Box Software Testing Foundations course, which introduced me to the idea of heuristics and to the idea of few hiccups, so the consistency heuristics. And it meant that I was equipped with a tool to help me test without requirements. And what I also found helpful was, let's say a lot of testing without requirements is somewhat instinctive. So when you know what they are, you know that it makes sense. Okay, sorry. Does everyone here know what the few hiccups or the heuristics is? I realize I don't want to ramp. Okay, so for example, there's one about consistency with, so I'm just trying to think of the best one to start with, because real world applications, comparable product, right? Okay, so comparable product, right? So if you were to test against this heuristic, you got WhatsApp as a messaging app, and you would use that app as a reference point for another messaging app. And then you could say that if you're building this app and you see a bug, this is bad behavior, or I think you should look into this, because WhatsApp, you're able to attach a photo. But then in our app, you can't attach a photo in this messaging app. So you're using it as a point of reference. And that could possibly not be in the requirements, but a user may expect that. So it also goes into user expectations. Another example would be learning how to monitor APIs. I talked to you earlier about learning how to test APIs. In my own time, I learned monitoring with Postman. And then what happened was I was on a project where one of the APIs we were reliant on would just keep going down, and then the customers would get angry at us because the customer isn't thinking, oh, the API went down. They're thinking something doesn't work, your app sucks. So we would then, I'd say, okay, well, we got to monitor the API, then get on their ass as soon as possible to fix it, and then hopefully look good in front of the customers. Lastly, one reason why I continue to invest in myself and why I'm happy that I do so is that it's made me more employable and relevant. So I said earlier about you may be unhappy in your role, so you may want to switch. But for me personally, when I got laid off, what I hated was the lack of control I had over my career. So I was making a joke about, you don't dump me, I dump you. And I say it in a joking way, but I prefer to be in charge of my career and not have my employer make the decision for me. So whether or not I'm happy with where I am and I choose to stay, or I want to move on, it's meant that I can choose to do that. And that is personally something that I value very highly. Now, looking forward, there are two questions I ask myself when it comes to investing in myself. The first is, where do I want to go? So these are my current goals. So I wrote a book, Starting Your Software Testing Career, and I would like that to be the go-to book for people starting their software testing career. The second would be to encourage people who are scared of learning test automation to learn test automation. To be clear, I've met a lot of people who want to learn, but they are intimidated. So to those people, I'd like to encourage them. And lastly, I'd like to get comfortable with Cypress and Playwright. I'm seeing increasing demand for this in my casual wee nosies on LinkedIn. And while I have worked a little bit with Cypress, again, it's not something I would claim on my CV. What am I doing to get there? What am I doing to achieve these goals? The first is I'm working on my personal brand. So you can't buy something you haven't heard of. So you notice that I'm on stage mentioning my book. No, okay. So I have a bad sense of humor. But so what I'm trying to do is publicize a book or publicize the knowledge that I have so that people are aware of the book or aware of the information I have to share. This conference talk is an example of that, but not everyone has employers who are supportive enough that can attend conference talks. Not everyone has the financial means to go into their own wallet and pay to attend a conference if they do not have a supportive employer. So I write in my blog for people who prefer to read, and I also have a YouTube channel for people who prefer to watch or listen to consume knowledge. The second is to encourage people who are scared of learning test automation. I'm writing my blog and creating videos. I'm sharing my experiences of how I went about it and also about how difficult I have found it. I don't have a technical background, or I did not have a technical background when I started. And I remember with some of the people I mentor, they also did not have a technical background, and then they get intimidated. And I would try and encourage them by saying that a lot of people could struggle at the start, and to know that certain speed bumps are somewhat normal. So I'd share some tips on what helped me. So for example, the time blocking, setting aside a time. I would share resources that I found very useful. So sometimes what would happen is, say someone wants to learn Cypress, or someone wants to learn like Selenium WebDriver. And then they look up a course on Udemy or something, and then the first course they found isn't very good. And they think, oh, I can't learn it. But then the problem I found wasn't really that they couldn't learn it, it's that they did not find a resource that was suitable for them or for their learning style. So I would try and say, just because it hasn't worked for you the first time, maybe the problem is the suitability of this learning resource for you. The problem might not be you. And lastly, in terms of getting comfortable with Cypress and Playwright, I've been taking online courses and then hopefully will later use practice websites. There are quite a few practice websites you can check out. So if you wanted to practice testing on a mobile app, web-based testing on an API, there's quite a bit online that you can have a wee nosy at. Now, when I think about where my priorities lie looking forward, I have to be clear with them because my time is limited. So I don't try to learn everything, and there's so much to learn. I like to think that while there are a lot of things I know, there are so many things I don't know. So I often ask myself, what will make me a better tester? Again, that's a lot. In the near future, there's often one thing that is more pressing. So I tend to limit myself to 1 to 3 active goals at a time, both earlier in my career and then now. You notice that there were 3 goals. For me, why I think this is useful is if you try to, or all I can speak is from my personal experience, when I try to do a lot of things, nothing gets done. So I limit myself to 3, make sure I achieve those 3, and then I move on. I'm also in no way committed to making sure I achieve those goals. So by that, I mean, new information can come up and I may realize that this goal I had of, say, promoting my book no longer feels important, and then I'll replace it. I'll forget it and I'll replace it. So I am not loyal to anything. So there are 3 questions I want to pose to you in the audience, and I hope going forward you can have a wee think about this. The first is, what are you doing to invest in yourself? The second is, what goals do you have? And lastly, what is one thing you can do today to bring you closer to one of those goals? Joachim,